The wedding ring burned against Jack's palm like a live coal as he stared at the spot where the girl had vanished into the fog. Around him, the small gathering of mourners continued their hushed conversations, oblivious to the earthquake that had just shattered his world. Margaret's sister Helen touched his elbow, her voice a distant murmur about casseroles and sympathy cards, but Jack couldn't process the words. His entire reality had condensed down to the simple gold band pressed against his calloused skin, a ring that should have been impossible. He'd watched the funeral director close that casket himself, had stood vigil through the viewing, memorizing Margaret's peaceful face one final time before they sealed her away forever. The ring had been on her finger then, catching the chapel's amber light, just as it had for over 2 decades of marriage. "Jack?" Helen's voice carried a note of concern. "The reception's at the church hall. People are expecting—" "I need a minute," he managed, his voice rough as gravel. The mourners began their slow exodus toward the parking area, their black umbrellas bobbing through the mist like funeral ravens. Jack remained rooted beside the grave, his weathered face a mask of confusion and growing dread. The preacher packed his worn Bible, offered a pat on Jack's shoulder that felt like a feather against stone, and disappeared into the gray morning. Alone except for the gravediggers waiting respectfully in the distance, Jack opened his fist and stared at the ring. No mistake. He knew every scratch, every tiny imperfection, the small dent from when Margaret had caught it on a fence post during their 2nd year of marriage, the worn spot where it had rubbed against her engagement ring, even the inscription inside forever, J and M, 1999. His mind reeled back to that terrible night 6 months ago when Sheriff Coleman had appeared at his door, hat in hand, explaining about the accident on Highway 287. Margaret's car had plunged into Willow Creek during the spring floods. The current had carried her downstream for nearly 3 miles before searchers found her body tangled in a deadfall. She'd been in the water for 2 days. The identification had been difficult, Coleman had explained with uncomfortable delicacy. The water damage, the time, but her dental records confirmed it. Margaret Riverside was dead, and Jack had buried his world with her, or thought he had. The fog shifted, revealing patches of the surrounding landscape, the dark line of pines that bordered the cemetery's eastern edge, the crumbling stone wall that marked the old section where Devil's Creek's founding families rested. Somewhere in those woods, a teenage girl with desperate eyes and impossible knowledge had appeared like a vision from his worst nightmare. She's being held in the old mining tunnels beneath Crow's Ridge. Jack knew those tunnels. Every rancher in the county did. The old copper mine had been abandoned since the 1960s, its shafts sealed and forgotten after a cave-in killed 3 men. Crow's Ridge itself loomed like a sleeping giant 15 miles north of town, honeycombed with passages that local kids dared each other to explore until someone inevitably got lost and the fire department had to mount a rescue. But why would anyone take Margaret there? And how could she be alive when he'd seen her body, touched her cold hand, kissed her forehead one last time before they closed the casket? The rational part of his mind, the part that had run a successful cattle operation for 30 years, insisted this was grief playing tricks. Hallucinations weren't uncommon after traumatic loss. The girl was probably some runaway who'd heard about the funeral, maybe even stolen the ring from the funeral home. There had to be a logical explanation. But the ring felt real enough. Real as the Montana soil beneath his boots, real as the ache that had lived in his chest for 6 months. Jack pocketed the ring and walked toward his truck, his mind churning. The black Ford sat alone in the gravel lot, patient as an old horse. He'd driven these roads for decades, knew every curve and straightaway between his ranch and town. The familiar ritual of checking mirrors and adjusting his seat usually brought comfort, but today his hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. Instead of heading toward the church reception, Jack found himself driving north on County Road 15, toward the dark silhouette of Crow's Ridge rising against the overcast sky. He told himself he was just looking, just trying to make sense of the impossible. But deep in his chest, beneath layers of grief and confusion, something else stirred, something he'd thought died with Margaret. Hope. The most dangerous emotion a man could carry, especially when logic screamed that hope would only lead to greater heartbreak. But as the ridge grew larger in his windshield and the fog began to lift, Jack pressed harder on the accelerator. If there was even the smallest chance that Margaret was alive somewhere in those tunnels, he had to know, even if the truth destroyed him. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as Jack pulled into the familiar circle drive of the Double R Ranch, the home he and Margaret had built together over 23 years of marriage. The two-story farmhouse sat like a lonely sentinel against the backdrop of rolling pasture, its white clapboard siding and forest green shutters exactly as Margaret had painted them last spring. She'd stood on a ladder for 3 days straight, insisting they couldn't afford to hire painters when she had two perfectly good hands and a stubborn streak a mile wide. Jack sat in the cab for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the empty rocking chairs on the wraparound porch. Margaret's chair still held the faded cushion she'd sewn from old quilting scraps, positioned at just the right angle to catch the morning sun. He'd left it exactly where she'd placed it, along with the half-finished crossword puzzle book on the side table and the coffee mug she'd used that final morning, the one with the chipped handle that read, "World's Best Ranch Wife." The silence hit him as soon as he opened the truck door. No border collie racing across the yard to greet him. Rex had been Margaret's dog and had refused to eat for weeks after the accident until Jack finally had to put him down. No country music drifting from the kitchen radio where Margaret would be starting dinner preparations, humming off-key to whatever song caught her fancy. Just the autumn wind whistling through the barn rafters and the distant lowing of cattle in the far pasture. Inside, the house felt like a museum. Jack had tried to maintain Margaret's routines, keeping the kitchen table set for two, leaving her reading glasses on the counter beside the coffee maker, even buying her favorite lavender soap for the guest bathroom she'd claimed as her own. The refrigerator still held her neat handwriting on magnetic notepads, grocery lists, appointment reminders, cheerful notes she'd leave for him on mornings when she had to drive to town early. "Don't forget to check the fence line by Miller's Creek. Love you, Em." That note was 6 months old now, the edges curled with humidity and handling. Jack had read it so many times he'd memorized every loop and flourish of her script. He poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey from the bottle he kept in Margaret's china cabinet, a liberty she never would have allowed when she was alive. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd started drinking more after losing the only person who'd ever successfully convinced him to drink less. She'd had a way of raising one eyebrow that could stop his hand mid-reach for the bottle, a silent communication perfected over decades of marriage. The ring felt heavy in his pocket as he settled into his leather recliner, the one piece of furniture that was purely his in a house Margaret had lovingly decorated with antique quilts, mason jar flower arrangements, and photographs spanning their life together. Wedding pictures, vacation snapshots, candid moments captured at church socials and county fairs. In every image, Margaret's smile blazed like sunshine, her auburn hair catching light, her green eyes sparkling with the kind of joy that had drawn him like a moth to flame from the moment they'd met at a barn dance in 1998. He'd been 47 then, a confirmed bachelor who'd convinced himself he was too set in his ways for love. She'd been 39, recently divorced, working as a veterinary assistant in town. She'd approached him during a two-step, bold as brass, and asked if he planned to dance or just hold up the wall all evening. Within 6 months, he'd proposed. Within a year, she'd moved to the ranch and transformed his sterile bachelor existence into something resembling a real home. Now that home felt like a mausoleum, every object a reminder of conversations that would never happen again, dreams that had died with her in Willow Creek. They'd talked about travel once the ranch was more established, Ireland to trace her family genealogy, Colorado to see the aspens turn gold. They'd discussed maybe getting another dog, possibly even thinking about foster care for older kids who needed a stable home. All of it gone in one terrible night when spring rains made the roads treacherous, and Margaret had insisted on driving to town to check on her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who'd been battling pneumonia. Jack pulled the wedding ring from his pocket, holding it up to catch the lamplight. The gold band looked exactly as he remembered, down to the tiny inscription that had required a magnifying glass to read when they'd ordered it 24 years ago. But that was impossible. He'd watched them lower Margaret's casket into the ground less than 4 hours ago. Yet here sat the ring, solid and undeniable, along with the memory of a desperate girl's words echoing in the fog, "Your wife isn't dead." Outside, the cattle began their evening chorus, a sound that usually brought him comfort. Tonight, it only emphasized how alone he was in this house full of ghosts, holding on to hope that felt as dangerous as nitroglycerin. The whiskey burned his throat, but it couldn't touch the ice that had settled in his veins. Jack set the glass down with a sharp clink, the sound echoing through the too-quiet house like a gunshot. He turned the ring over in his palm, studying it under the lamplight until his eyes watered. Every detail screamed authenticity: the weight, the color, even the faint scratches that mapped out decades of Margaret's life. A sudden knock at the front door shattered the silence. Jack's head snapped up, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nobody visited the Double R after dark, not anymore. Not since Margaret died, and the steady stream of casserole-bearing neighbors had finally dried up. He glanced at the mantel clock, 8:47 p.m. Too late for condolence calls, too early for emergencies that couldn't wait for morning. The knock came again, more insistent. 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo Margaret's old pattern when she'd forgotten her keys. Jack rose slowly, his joints protesting after the long day. Through the front window, he could make out a dark shape on the porch, barely visible against the backdrop of fog that had followed him home from the cemetery. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle rack beside the door, old habits from a lifetime of living in country where the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and the sheriff's response time could stretch to an hour on a good day. But something about the silhouette stopped him. Too small for a man, too still for trouble. He opened the door to find the girl from the graveyard. Up close, she looked even younger than he'd first thought, maybe 15, 16 at most. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around a face that might have been pretty if not for the hollowed cheeks and deep shadows under her eyes. The same dirt-stained clothes clung to her thin frame, and her bare feet were cut and bleeding from whatever path had brought her to his door. "You didn't go to the mines," she said without preamble, her voice carrying a tremor that might have been fear or exhaustion. Jack's grip tightened on the door frame. "Who are you?" "That doesn't matter." She glanced over her shoulder into the darkness, a nervous gesture that sent prickles up Jack's spine. "What matters is that they're going to move her soon. Tonight, maybe tomorrow. If you don't act now—" "Hold on." Jack stepped onto the porch, scanning the shadows beyond the circle of light spilling from his windows. "Who's going to move who? What the hell are you talking about?" The girl's eyes fixed on his with desperate intensity. "Your wife, Margaret. They know someone saw her at the funeral, know someone's asking questions. They'll relocate her to one of the other sites, and then you'll never find her." The words hit him like physical blows. Jack felt his knees weaken, forced himself to lean against the porch railing for support. "That's impossible. I buried my wife today. I saw her body." "You saw what they wanted you to see." The girl stepped closer, and Jack caught the scent of pine needles and something else. Antiseptic, like a hospital corridor. The woman in that casket wasn't Margaret Riverside. They needed everyone to believe she was dead so no one would come looking. Jack's vision blurred at the edges. "You're lying, you're sick, or you're playing some kind of—" "She has a scar on her left shoulder," the girl interrupted. "Shaped like a crescent moon. Got it when she fell off her bicycle as a kid, trying to impress some boy named Tommy Hutchins." The world tilted sideways. Jack had never told anyone that story, how Margaret had confessed it to him on their honeymoon, laughing about childhood crushes while tracing the pale mark on her shoulder. Even her sister Helen didn't know the details. "How could you possibly—" "Because she told me." The girl's voice cracked. "3 days ago, when they brought me to the same place they're keeping her. I escaped. She didn't." A truck's engine rumbled in the distance, growing closer. The girl's head whipped toward the sound, her body going rigid with terror. "They're coming," she whispered. "I led them here. God, I'm sorry, I thought I was careful." Headlights swept across the ranch's entrance. 2 sets moving fast up the gravel drive. The girl bolted toward the porch steps, but Jack caught her arm. "Wait. If this is real, if Margaret's really alive, why should I trust you? Why would anyone take her, keep her?" The girl turned back, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. Because some people are worth more alive than dead, Mr. Riverside. And your wife saw something the night of her accident, something that could destroy very powerful people. The trucks were close now, their headlights painting stark shadows across the yard. Jack felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a yoke. Believe this desperate child and chase impossible hope into darkness, or slam the door and cling to the safe certainty of grief. Margaret's wedding ring seemed to pulse against his palm, warm as a heartbeat. "Run," he told the girl, stepping back into his house. "I'll hold them off." But when he turned, she was already gone, swallowed by the Montana night like smoke. Jack slammed the door and threw the deadbolt, his hands shaking as the girl's words echoed in his mind. Some people are worth more alive than dead. The headlights grew brighter through his front windows, casting moving shadows across Margaret's carefully arranged living room like accusing fingers. He pressed his back against the door, feeling the solid wood against his spine. The same door Margaret had painted last spring, humming while she worked. Everything in this house carried her memory, and now this stranger claimed those memories were built on a lie. The trucks rumbled to a stop in his driveway. Doors slammed. Footsteps crunched across gravel. Jack's mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. If Margaret was alive, if she'd been alive all these months while he'd grieved her, while he stood at her supposed grave and poured his heart into empty ground, what did that make him? What kind of husband failed so completely to recognize that his wife of 23 years was still breathing somewhere in the darkness? But if the girl was lying, if this was some elaborate con or the desperate fantasy of a disturbed teenager, then he was about to destroy what little piece he'd managed to cobble together from the wreckage of his life. The whiskey and the routine, the careful preservation of Margaret's belongings, the slow acceptance that some wounds never heal but you learn to live around them, all of it would crumble the moment he admitted hope back into his heart. 3 sharp knocks rattled the door behind him. "Mr. Riverside?" A man's voice, calm and professional. "Sheriff's Department. We need to speak with you." Jack recognized the voice. Deputy Martinez, who'd helped with the search when Margaret first went missing. A good man, far as Jack knew. But the girl's terror when she'd heard the trucks suggested these weren't rescue vehicles. "Your wife saw something the night of her accident, something that could destroy very powerful people." "Just a minute," Jack called, buying time. He moved to the front window and peered through Margaret's lace curtains. 2 black SUVs sat in his driveway, their engines still running. Not Sheriff's Department vehicles. The license plates were obscured by mud, and the men standing beside them wore dark clothing that swallowed them into the night. Deputy Martinez stepped into the porch light, but something was wrong. His uniform looked right, his badge caught the light properly, but his stance was all wrong, too aggressive, too ready. Behind him stood 2 other men Jack didn't recognize, their faces hidden in shadow. "We understand you had a visitor tonight," Martinez continued. "Teenage girl, probably scared, maybe hurt. She's wanted in connection with several break-ins in the county. Did she come by here?" Jack's throat went dry. The easy thing would be to tell them the truth. Yes, she'd been here. Yes, she'd run off into the darkness spouting impossible stories. Let them chase her down and sort out whatever game she was playing. Go back to his whiskey and his grief and the familiar ache that had become his closest companion. But something in Martinez's voice made him hesitate. A coldness that hadn't been there 6 months ago when the deputy had sat in this very living room, hat in hand, explaining how they'd found Margaret's body. That Martinez had been gentle, almost fatherly. This one sounded like a man following orders. Jack touched the wedding ring in his pocket, feeling its impossible weight. Margaret had always been the brave one in their marriage. She'd been the one to approach him at that barn dance, the one to suggest they take in foster kids, the one who'd driven out into a spring storm to check on an elderly neighbor, even though Jack had begged her to wait until morning. If their positions were reversed, if he were the one trapped in some dark place while the world believed him dead, Margaret wouldn't hesitate. She'd tear apart heaven and earth to find him, no matter how impossible it seemed. "Mr. Riverside?" Martinez's voice carried a note of impatience now. "We know you're in there. We just need to ask a few questions." The smart play was to open the door. cooperate with what appeared to be a legitimate investigation, trust the system he'd relied on his whole life, the same system that had identified Margaret's body and helped him plan her funeral. But the girl's desperate eyes haunted him. The way she'd known about the scar, about Tommy Hutchins, details so private that even Margaret's own sister didn't know them. And the ring, solid and real in his pocket, carrying the weight of 24 years of marriage. Jack closed his eyes and made his choice. "Sorry, deputy," he called through the door. "Didn't see any girl. Been drinking since the funeral. Probably wouldn't have noticed if a whole parade came through here." The silence that followed felt dangerous. Finally, Martinez spoke again, his voice colder than the Montana night. "Well, if you do see her, Mr. Riverside, you call us right away. Girl's more dangerous than she looks." Jack stood motionless against the door, listening to the footsteps retreat across his porch. The truck engines idled for what felt like an eternity before finally rumbling back down the drive, their red taillights disappearing into the fog like dying embers. Only when the silence returned did he realize he'd been holding his breath. The lie hung in the air around him, tangible as smoke. In 62 years of life, Jack Riverside had built his reputation on straight dealing and honest words. Even as a child, he'd been incapable of deception. His mother used to joke that she could read his face like a book with large print. But tonight, standing in Margaret's living room surrounded by her quilts and photographs, he'd lied to a law enforcement officer without hesitation. Because something was wrong, terribly, fundamentally wrong. Jack moved to the window and watched until he was certain the vehicles were gone, then grabbed his jacket from the coat closet. The familiar weight of the canvas settled across his shoulders like armor. Margaret had bought him this jacket for his 50th birthday, insisting the dark green brought out his eyes. He'd worn it through 2 harsh winters and countless dawn rides across his property, and it still carried the faint scent of her lavender soap. The wedding ring burned against his palm as he stepped into the night. The fog had thickened, turning his familiar ranch into an alien landscape. The barn loomed like a ghost ship in the distance, and the mountains beyond had vanished entirely behind walls of gray. But Jack knew these 40 acres better than his own reflection. He could navigate them blindfolded. His boots crunched across frost-brittle grass as he made his way toward the tree line where the girl had vanished. Every instinct screamed that he was walking away from sanity, stepping across a threshold he could never uncross. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to go back inside, pour another whiskey, and wait for morning to restore order to a world turned upside down. But Margaret's voice echoed in his memory. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Jack. It's doing what's right, even when you're scared." She'd said that the night before she died, when they'd discussed taking in their first foster child. They'd talked for hours about the responsibility, the heartbreak that came with loving children who might leave. In the end, Margaret had convinced him that some risks were worth taking, that a life lived in complete safety wasn't really living at all. Now, surrounded by fog that seemed to muffle even his own footsteps, Jack understood what she'd meant. The months since her death had been safe, predictable grief, familiar pain, the comfort of routines that honored her memory without challenging his understanding of what was possible. But safety had been killing him slowly, one whiskey-soaked evening at a time. The girl's words came back to him. "They'll relocate her to one of the other sites, and then you'll never find her." If this was madness, at least it was madness with purpose. At least it was movement instead of the slow surrender he'd been calling survival. Jack reached the edge of his property where his fence line met the national forest. Here, the fog thinned enough for him to make out the narrow deer trail that wound up toward Crow's Ridge. He'd hunted these mountains for 30 years, knew every rock formation and hidden valley, but he'd never paid attention to the old mining tunnels that honeycombed the ridge like Swiss cheese, abandoned shafts from the 1890s, when prospectors had chased gold and silver through these hills before the ore played out. If someone wanted to hide people, those tunnels would be perfect. Miles from civilization, forgotten by everyone except historians and the occasional lost hiker. Cell service was non-existent, and the terrain was brutal enough to discourage casual exploration. Jack pulled out his phone and stared at the blank screen. He should call Helen, Margaret's sister, tell her what was happening. Should contact the real sheriff's department, report the fake deputies and their unmarked vehicles. Should do any number of rational things that would keep him anchored to the world he understood. Instead, he turned off the phone entirely. The fog swirled around him like water as he crossed into the forest, leaving behind the last lights of his ranch. With each step up the mountain trail, Jack felt the familiar moorings of his life falling away. The careful routines, the preserved memories, the safe harbor of accepted grief, all of it belonged to the man he'd been an hour ago. That man had buried his wife and learned to live with loss. This man was going to find her. The wedding ring pulsed against his palm like a second heartbeat as Jack Riverside walked into the darkness, following a desperate girl's impossible promise toward whatever truth waited in the abandoned depths of Crow's Ridge. Behind him, the fog closed over his tracks like a door swinging shut. There was no going back now. The trail up Crow's Ridge tested every muscle in Jack's aging body. What had once been a manageable climb now felt like scaling a cliff face, each step sending jolts of pain through his knees. The fog clung to him like wet wool, and more than once he stumbled over hidden roots that the mist transformed into grasping fingers. 20 minutes into the climb, he heard voices. Jack froze behind a massive pine, his heart hammering loud enough that he was certain it would give him away. Two men were descending the trail, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Their words drifted down to him in fragments: move the cargo, too much heat, clean up the loose ends. The voices belonged to the men who'd come to his ranch. Jack pressed himself against the tree bark, feeling the rough edges dig into his back through Margaret's anniversary jacket. The men passed within 10 feet of his hiding spot, close enough that he could smell their cigarettes and hear the crackle of radio static from their equipment. When their footsteps finally faded, Jack emerged from cover on shaking legs. Cargo. They'd called someone cargo, as if human beings were just inventory to be relocated. The casual inhumanity of it made his stomach turn. The trail split ahead, one path continuing toward the ridge's summit, another angling toward what his grandfather had called the Devil's Backbone, a narrow spine of rock where the old miners had dug their deepest shafts. Jack chose the latter, following instinct and half-remembered stories from his childhood about prospectors who'd vanished into those tunnels and never emerged. The first mine entrance appeared like a wound in the mountainside, partially concealed by decades of overgrowth. Jack approached cautiously, noting the signs of recent activity, trampled vegetation, tire tracks in the mud, and something that made his blood freeze: fresh footprints in the soft earth, including several that could have belonged to a teenage girl. A sound emerged from the depths of the tunnel, not quite a voice, not quite a cry, but something human and desperate that seemed to echo off stone walls before dissolving into silence. Jack pulled out his phone, forgetting he'd turned it off. Even if it worked, what would he tell the authorities? That he was chasing a ghost story into abandoned mines because a runaway girl had shown him his dead wife's wedding ring? They'd assume grief had finally driven him over the edge. But as he stared at the dark mouth of the tunnel, another memory surfaced. Margaret's funeral had drawn half the county, but one face had been notably absent: Dr. Edmund Carver, the county coroner. Margaret had spoken of him often, how he'd helped establish the regional medical examiner's office, how he'd modernized the whole system. Yet the man who'd officially pronounced her dead hadn't attended her burial. At the time, Jack had attributed his absence to professional distance. Now, standing at the threshold of a mine where human cargo was apparently stored, other explanations suggested themselves. A flashlight beam suddenly swept across the trail behind him. Jack dove into the tunnel entrance, pressing himself against the stone wall just inside the opening. The light passed by twice before moving on, but the message was clear: they were hunting. Whether for him or the girl or both, the men with fake badges were combing these mountains with systematic precision. The tunnel stretched ahead into perfect darkness. Jack had no light, no weapon beyond the pocket knife he'd carried for 30 years, and no plan beyond a desperate father's need to know the truth. But Margaret's ring seemed to pull him forward like a compass needle, and somewhere in the labyrinth ahead, answers waited. He took his first step into the mine, then another. The darkness swallowed him completely, but his fingers found grooves in the stone walls, old tool marks left by long-dead miners who'd chased veins of silver through solid rock. He used these as guides, moving deeper into the mountain while his eyes slowly adjusted to gradations of black he'd never known existed. The tunnel branched ahead. Jack paused, listening for any sound that might guide his choice. From the left passage came only silence, but the right seemed to carry the faintest whisper of moving air. He chose right, following what might have been ventilation toward whatever waited in the mountain's heart. Behind him, he could hear other footsteps entering the tunnel. Professional, measured steps that belonged to men who knew these passages well. They were tracking him now, and unlike Jack, they came prepared with lights and weapons and the confidence of hunters pursuing prey. The wedding ring burned against his palm as Jack pushed deeper into Crow's Ridge, leaving behind the last trace of moonlight. Somewhere ahead lay either salvation or madness, truth or elaborate deception. But after 6 months of slow death by grief, even the promise of answers felt like resurrection. The mountain held its secrets close, but Jack Riverside was done being careful. Whatever waited in the darkness, he would face it. The darkness pressed against Jack like a living thing, thick and suffocating in the narrow tunnel. Each footstep echoed off stone walls that seemed to close in around him, and the air grew colder with every yard deeper into Crow's Ridge. The old tool marks under his fingertips became his lifeline, guiding him through a maze carved by desperate men chasing dreams of silver and gold. The footsteps behind him grew closer, professional boots on stone, steady and confident. They knew these tunnels, had walked them before. Jack quickened his pace, fighting the urge to break into a run that would only announce his position to every ear in the mountain. The passage curved sharply left, then descended at a steep angle. Jack's knees protested as he half walked, half slid down the slope, using the wall for support. The wedding ring in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step, pulling him forward like Margaret herself was guiding him through this labyrinth of stone and shadow. A new sound reached him, voices, distant but unmistakably human. Not the searchers behind him, but something from the depths ahead. Jack strained to make out words, but the tunnel acoustics turned everything into whispers that might have been wind through cracks in the rock. The passage leveled out, and suddenly Jack could sense space opening around him. The claustrophobic walls fell away, and his footsteps took on the hollow ring of a larger chamber. He stopped, listening, trying to map the darkness with his ears alone. That's when he heard it clearly, a woman's voice, weak but distinctly female, speaking words he couldn't quite catch. The sound came from somewhere ahead and to his right, beyond what felt like a vast underground cavern. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs. 6 months of grief had prepared him for many things, but not for the possibility that Margaret's voice might actually be waiting in the darkness. The rational part of his mind, the part that had run a successful ranch for 3 decades, insisted this was madness. Dead women didn't speak from abandoned mines, wedding rings didn't appear at funerals. Teenage girls didn't materialize from forests with impossible truths. But the voice came again, and this time he caught a single word that nearly brought him to his knees. Jack. Behind him, the searchers had reached the steep section. He could hear them talking in low voices, coordinating their approach. Their flashlight beams would be visible soon, turning his cover of darkness into a liability. Whatever he was going to do, it had to be now. Jack felt along the cavern wall until he found another opening, a side passage that angled toward the source of the voices. This tunnel was older, rougher, hand-carved rather than blasted. The miners who dug this shaft had worked by candlelight, following veins of ore deeper into the mountain than safety would recommend. Some of them had never come back out. The passage narrowed again, forcing Jack to move in a crouch. His back screamed in protest, but Margaret's voice, it had to be Margaret's voice, drew him forward. How many times had he dreamed of hearing it again? How many nights had he lain in their empty bed, replaying conversations, memorizing the cadence of her laugh? But those had been dreams, and this was stone beneath his hands, cold air burning his lungs, the very real possibility that his wife had been suffering in darkness while he'd mourned her at an empty grave. The tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller than the first. Here, the voices were clearer, though still muffled by distance and stone. Multiple people, at least some of them women. One voice rose above the others, younger, desperate, familiar, the runaway girl. "Told you, they moved her last night." Her words echoed off cavern walls, distorted but understandable. Trying to find out what she knew. A man's voice answered, but Jack couldn't make out the words. The tone was harsh, threatening. The girl's response came sharp with fear. "She's alive! I saw them take her to the deep shaft." Jack's breath caught. Margaret, alive and moved to another location. The girl hadn't been lying, hadn't been spinning elaborate fantasies. Somewhere in this network of abandoned mines, his wife was being held by people who'd faked her death and buried an empty casket, while Jack stood graveside with a heart full of grief. The enormity of it staggered him. The funeral, the condolences, the careful preservation of her belongings, all of it built on a lie so massive it redefined everything he thought he knew about loss and love and the world he'd trusted for 62 years. Light suddenly blazed behind him. Flashlight beams cutting through the darkness of the main passage, accompanied by voices that carried the authority of men accustomed to being obeyed. Jack was trapped between two groups now, the searchers behind him and unknown threats ahead. The smart play would be to surrender, to trust that rational explanations existed for everything he'd seen and heard, but the wedding ring in his pocket pulsed like a heartbeat, and Margaret's voice had spoken his name from the depths of a mountain that was supposed to hold only ghosts. He pressed himself against the cavern wall and prepared to discover what truths were worth dying for. The flashlight beams swept closer, their harsh white light transforming the cavern into a cathedral of dancing shadows. Jack flattened himself against the stone wall, feeling the cold seep through Margaret's anniversary jacket as voices echoed from both directions, the searchers behind him closing in with methodical precision, and somewhere ahead, the girl's desperate pleas growing more frantic. She knew about the transport routes, the girl was saying, her voice cracking with exhaustion. That's why they took her. She saw something at the clinic. A man's voice cut her off, sharp as breaking glass. "Shut up. You've said enough." Margaret had volunteered at the county health clinic every Tuesday for 5 years, helping elderly patients navigate insurance paperwork and prescription requirements. Jack had always admired her dedication, the way she'd light up talking about Mrs. Henderson's recovery or Mr. Kowalski's improved mobility. But now those innocent memories curdled into something darker. What had she seen? What transport routes? The searcher's radio crackled behind him. "Delta Team, report your position. Sector 7, approaching the junction chamber." No visual on the target. Target. They weren't just looking for him. They were hunting him with military precision. Jack's hands trembled as he felt along the cavern wall, searching for another passage, another escape route deeper into the mountain's maze. His fingers found nothing but solid stone and the growing certainty that he'd walked into a trap with no exit. Ahead, the girl's voice rose in desperation. "The deep shaft connects to Tunnel 9. That's where they're keeping the women until the next shipment." I said, "Shut up." The crack of a hand against flesh echoed through the chamber, followed by a cry of pain that sent ice through Jack's veins. They were hurting her, this child who'd risked everything to tell him the truth about Margaret. The flashlight beams swept closer. In seconds, they'd illuminate his hiding spot and end whatever chance he had of reaching Margaret. But what chance did he really have? A 62-year-old rancher with bad knees and a pocket knife against professionals with radios and weapons, and the advantage of knowing these tunnels. The smart thing would be surrender. The rational thing would be to trust the system, call for help, let qualified people handle whatever conspiracy had swallowed his wife. But Margaret's ring burned against his palm like a brand, and somewhere in this mountain she was alive, had been alive for 6 months while he'd grieved over an empty casket. Jack closed his eyes and made the choice that would define whatever remained of his life. He stepped into the light. "I'm here," he called out, his voice carrying across the cavern with surprising strength. "Jack Riverside, I'm here and I'm not running." The flashlight beams swung toward him like spotlights on a stage. 3 men in tactical gear emerged from the tunnel behind him, their faces hidden behind night vision equipment. Professional contractors, not local law enforcement. The kind of men who disappeared problems permanently. Mr. Riverside, the center figure, spoke with quiet authority. "You've wandered pretty far from home tonight." "Not far enough, apparently." Jack kept his hands visible but ready. The pocket knife seemed pathetic now, but it was all he had. "Where's my wife?" "Your wife is dead, sir. Has been for 6 months. I think grief has affected your judgment." "Grief doesn't explain her wedding ring showing up at the funeral." Jack pulled the ring from his pocket, let it catch the flashlight beam. The gold gleamed like a promise in the harsh white light. Ring that was supposed to be buried with her body. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the man's face. Behind him, his partners shifted position, hands moving toward weapons. The cavern felt smaller suddenly, the weight of the mountain pressing down like a held breath. "Rings can be replaced, Mr. Riverside, copied. Grief makes people vulnerable to elaborate hoaxes." "And what about the girl? What about the voices I heard?" Jack took a step forward, gambling everything on momentum. "What about transport routes and shipments and women being held in mining shafts?" The man's expression hardened. "I think you're confused about what you heard in these tunnels. Sound plays tricks in places like this. Echoes wind through the rock. A grieving man might interpret natural phenomena as something more significant." But Jack was listening beyond the words now, straining to hear what lay deeper in the mountain. The voices ahead had gone silent, but something else reached him. The faint sound of machinery, generators perhaps, the electronic hum of equipment that had no business existing in abandoned mines. "You're going to come with us now, Mr. Riverside. Back to your ranch, back to your normal life. This ends here." "No," Jack said quietly. "This begins here." The wedding ring caught the light again as he closed his fist around it. Somewhere in the darkness beyond these men, Margaret was waiting. 6 months of grief had nearly killed him, but it had also taught him something precious. When you've already lost everything, you have nothing left to fear. Jack Riverside stepped into his ordeal. The first gunshot split the cavern air like thunder. Jack dove left as the muzzle flash illuminated the chamber in stark, brutal white. Stone exploded where his head had been, showering him with fragments that drew blood from his cheek. He rolled behind a boulder formation, his 62-year-old body screaming protests as he scrambled for cover. "Containment is blown," the leader's voice echoed off the walls. "Switch to elimination protocol." More gunshots. The tactical team spread out with military precision, their night vision giving them every advantage in the darkness that had been Jack's only protection. He pressed himself against the rock, feeling Margaret's ring bite into his palm as his fist clenched around it. From somewhere ahead came a sound that froze his blood. The girl screaming. Not pain, but terror. They were moving her, probably eliminating witnesses now that Jack had stumbled too close to their operation. "Margaret!" Jack shouted into the darkness, abandoning stealth for one desperate chance. "Margaret, I'm here!" His voice bounced off stone walls, multiplying into a chorus of his own desperation. For a moment, the gunfire stopped. In that silence, from somewhere deep in the mountain's heart, came an answer that shattered what remained of his sanity. "Jack, help me." Margaret's voice, weak and broken but unmistakably real. 6 months of grief collapsed into a single moment of horrifying clarity. She was alive, had been alive while he'd stood at her funeral, while he'd slept in their empty bed, while he'd slowly poisoned himself with guilt over an accident that hadn't killed her at all. "She's in Tunnel 9!" The girl's voice carried across the cavern before cutting off abruptly. A man's harsh curse followed, then the sound of running footsteps moving away from Jack's position. They were relocating everything. The voices, the equipment, Margaret herself, all of it disappearing deeper into the mountain while he cowered. Behind rocks with 3 armed men hunting him in the dark, Jack broke cover. He ran toward the sound of retreating footsteps, toward Tunnel 9 and whatever chance remained of reaching Margaret before they moved her again. Gunshots erupted behind him, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning. A bullet whined past his ear. Another sparked off stone inches from his shoulder. The tunnel entrance loomed ahead, a black mouth that promised either salvation or death. Jack dove through it as automatic weapons fire stitched across the cavern wall behind him, filling the air with pulverized stone and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Inside the tunnel, emergency lighting flickered to life. Motion sensors, activated by his passage, revealed a nightmare of modern infrastructure grafted onto 19th-century mining shafts. Steel reinforcements, ventilation systems, electrical conduits snaking along the walls like technological parasites feeding on the mountain's bones. Jack ran down a corridor that belonged in an underground facility, not an abandoned mine. Doors lined both walls, heavy steel barriers with electronic locks and small observation windows. Through one, he glimpsed movement and pressed his face to the glass. Women, a dozen of them, maybe more, huddled in what had once been a mining chamber. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes dirty, their eyes holding the hollow look of people who'd given up hope. This wasn't just about Margaret. This was something vast and terrible, a human trafficking operation using the old mining network as its distribution hub. Behind him, boots pounded on stone. The tactical team had followed him into the tunnel, and their night vision would be useless now in the artificial lighting. For the first time since this nightmare began, Jack had a fighting chance. He found Tunnel 9 marked with a hand-painted sign. The passage beyond was darker, older, lit only by battery-powered emergency strips. Jack plunged into it, following a path that descended sharply into the mountain's deepest recesses. Margaret's voice called out again, closer now. "Jack! Oh God, Jack!" He rounded a corner and saw her. Margaret sat chained to the wall of a natural cavern, her face bruised, her clothes torn, but alive. Gloriously, impossibly alive. 6 months of grief evaporated in an instant as Jack stumbled toward her, tears streaming down his face. "Margaret, I'm here. I'm—" The rifle barrel pressed against the base of his skull stopped him cold. "Hello, Mr. Riverside," Dr. Edmund Carver's cultured voice spoke from the shadows. "I was wondering when you'd finally find us." The county coroner stepped into view, his medical examiner's badge glinting in the emergency lighting. Behind him stood 2 more armed men, and in the corner, the runaway girl lay motionless in a pool of blood. "You see, your wife discovered our operation quite by accident," Carver continued conversationally. "A simple clerical error at the clinic, a shipping manifest mixed in with patient files. But Margaret was always so thorough, wasn't she? She started asking questions." Jack's legs nearly gave out. The wedding ring slipped from his nerveless fingers, striking the stone floor with a sound like a funeral bell. Margaret was alive, but he was too late. The girl who'd tried to save them both was dead, and he'd walked straight into Carver's hands. "The accident was supposed to kill her cleanly," Carver said, "but she survived the crash, so we improvised." Amazing what a corrupt coroner can accomplish with a little creative paperwork. All seemed lost in the depths of Crow's Ridge, where love and hope came to die. The rifle barrel against Jack's skull felt cold as winter stone, but something in Dr. Carver's voice, a thread of uncertainty beneath the cultured confidence, made Jack focus beyond his terror. The coroner was talking too much, explaining too eagerly, like a man trying to convince himself as much as his audience. 6 months, Jack said quietly, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "You kept her alive for 6 months. Why?" Carver's laugh was brittle. "Insurance, Mr. Riverside. Your wife saw more than just shipping manifests. She photographed them, and despite our best efforts, we never found where she hid those photographs." Margaret's eyes met Jack's across the cavern, and in them he saw something that stopped his breath. Not defeat, but defiance. Her hands weren't just chained to the wall, her fingers were positioned deliberately, forming letters against the stone. SHIRTPOCKET. The anniversary jacket. The one she'd worn to dinner at Romano's. The one he'd brought tonight because it still smelled like her perfume. His hand moved instinctively toward the chest pocket, and Carver's rifle pressed harder against his skull. Slowly, Mr. Riverside. Jack's fingers found the pocket, empty except for, his breath caught, a micro SD card, no bigger than a fingernail, hidden in the jacket's inner seam. Margaret had sewn it there before the accident. Insurance against the very situation they now faced. But that wasn't the revelation that made Jack's world shift on its axis. The runaway girl in the corner, the one Carver thought was dead, opened her eyes and looked directly at him. Blood matted her hair, but her breathing was steady, controlled. She'd been playing dead, waiting. Her lips moved silently. 3, 2, 1. The emergency lighting died. In the absolute darkness that followed, Jack understood three things simultaneously. The girl had sabotaged the power system. Carver's men would switch to night vision within seconds. And Margaret had been planning this moment for 6 months. "Now, Jack!" Margaret's voice cut through the chaos as metal clanged against stone, handcuffs that had never been properly locked, another part of her elaborate deception. Jack threw himself sideways as Carver's rifle discharged, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the cavern in stark detail. Margaret was moving, rolling away from the wall. The girl was on her feet, blood real but not fatal, her hand reaching for something hidden behind the rock formation. But the most shocking sight was Carver himself. Not the composed coroner Jack had known for 15 years, but a man whose face was twisted with panic, whose hands shook as he worked the rifle's bolt action. This wasn't a criminal mastermind. This was a small-town doctor who'd gotten in too deep and was drowning. "The manifests are already uploaded." Margaret's voice came from the darkness, calm and certain. "Every transaction, every route, every government official on your payroll, they go public in..." A pause. 67 minutes unless I enter the abort code." Night vision goggles hummed to life. Green targeting dots swept the cavern as Carver's men oriented themselves. But Jack was moving now, muscle memory from decades of pre-dawn cattle rounds guiding him through darkness that was as familiar as his own land. His shoulder connected with the nearest gunman, sending them both crashing into the cavern wall. Jack's pocketknife found flesh, not a killing blow, but enough to send the weapon clattering across stone. Behind him, the girl was moving with the fluid grace of someone far more dangerous than a teenage runaway. "She's FBI," Carver's voice was breaking now. "The girl, she's been undercover for 8 months. This whole thing is blown." The revelation hit Jack like a physical blow. The desperate child who'd grabbed his hand at the funeral, who'd led him into this nightmare, was federal law enforcement. Margaret's disappearance hadn't been random. It had been part of a larger investigation that had turned his wife into bait. Margaret knew. The girl, the agent, spoke for the first time with adult authority. She volunteered to stay when she discovered the operation. We needed someone on the inside. Jack's world tilted. His wife hadn't been a victim. She'd been an active participant in her own disappearance. The grief that had nearly destroyed him. The guilt over the accident. The funeral where he'd stood broken-hearted over an empty casket. All of it had been theater, a performance designed to maintain the illusion of her death while she gathered evidence from within Carver's operation. 6 months, Jack whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "You let me think you were dead for 6 months." Margaret's hand found his in the darkness, her wedding ring back where it belonged, warm against his palm. "I couldn't tell you, Jack. You had to grieve publicly, convincingly. They were watching you, waiting for any sign that you knew the truth." Love and betrayal warred in Jack's chest as gunfire erupted again, but now it came from the tunnel entrance. Backup arriving, real law enforcement this time. The investigation was over, the trafficking ring exposed, the corrupt officials identified. But Jack stared at his wife in the strobing muzzle flashes and realized he was looking at a stranger who wore Margaret's face, who'd sacrificed their marriage for justice, who'd let him suffer because his pain had been necessary for her mission. The woman he'd loved was dead after all. She'd just been wearing someone else's grave. The gunfire faded to echoes, replaced by the controlled voices of federal agents securing the scene. Jack sat on the cavern floor, his back against cold stone, watching Margaret receive medical attention from the FBI medic. She looked so familiar, the curve of her neck, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, yet every gesture felt like a magic trick performed by a skilled imposter. "Mr. Riverside?" The young agent who'd pretended to be a runaway knelt beside him. Up close, her professionalism was unmistakable. "I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen. We need to debrief you, but first, how are you holding up?" Jack almost laughed. How was he holding up? 6 hours ago, he'd thought he was a widower attending his wife's delayed funeral. Now he was sitting in a dismantled human trafficking hub, married to a woman who'd chosen to let him suffer rather than trust him with the truth. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Ask me tomorrow." Chen nodded with surprising understanding. "The operation is larger than we initially realized. Carver was small time. The real money came from shipping routes through Canada. Your wife's evidence documented 3 years of transactions worth millions. And that was worth destroying our marriage for?" Chen's expression softened. "Mr. Riverside, in the 6 months Margaret maintained her cover, we identified 47 women who would have been trafficked through these tunnels. Because of her sacrifice, they're free. Because of your grief, your very public, very convincing grief, the operation continued to function normally, allowing us to map the entire network." Jack watched Margaret across the cavern. She was talking to another agent, her voice professional and measured. This wasn't his wife slowly recovering from trauma. This was a federal asset completing her mission. "She volunteered for this," Chen continued. "When she stumbled across those shipping manifests, she could have simply reported them. Instead, she offered to maintain her cover inside the operation. We told her the personal cost would be enormous. But you didn't tell me. We couldn't risk it. These people killed anyone who threatened them. If you'd known Margaret was alive, if you'd changed your behavior even slightly, it would have exposed the operation and gotten her killed for real." The logic was sound, even admirable. Jack understood that intellectually. Emotionally, he felt like he'd been buried alive while his wife played dead. Dr. Carver was led past them in restraints, his medical examiner's badge removed, his face gray with defeat. He looked smaller now, deflated, a man who'd traded his oath to save lives for money he'd never get to spend. Behind him came 2 more arrests, Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Webb and County Commissioner Patricia Daniels. The corruption had spread through Devil's Creek like cancer. "There's something else," Chen said carefully. "Margaret specifically requested that when this was over, when the arrests were made, she wanted to be the one to explain everything to you. She's been planning what to say for months." Jack watched his wife approach, her medical clearance complete. Each step brought her closer to a conversation that would define whatever remained of their relationship. She sat beside him on the stone floor, close enough to touch but somehow oceans away. "Jack, don't," he said quietly. "Don't apologize for saving those women. Don't apologize for doing the right thing. But don't ask me to pretend this doesn't change everything." Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "I know. God, Jack, I know what this cost us. Every day I wanted to call, to send some sign that I was alive. But if I'd broken cover, more people would have died. I understand." Jack turned to look at her directly. "What I don't understand is how we rebuild from this. How do I trust someone who's that good at deceiving people she loves?" "You don't," Margaret said simply. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But Jack, the woman you married, the one who couldn't stand watching innocent people suffer, who'd rather sacrifice her own happiness than let evil go unpunished, she's still here. That part was never an act." Around them, federal agents continued processing the crime scene. Evidence bags, photographs, chain of custody forms, the methodical dismantling of a criminal enterprise that had operated beneath Devil's Creek for years. The scope of it staggered Jack. While he'd been ranching cattle and living his quiet life, his hometown had been harboring modern slavery. "What happens now?" he asked. "Trials, testimony, media attention you won't enjoy," Agent Chen interjected. "The Bureau will offer you both protection if needed, counseling resources, whatever support we can provide." Jack nodded, but his focus remained on Margaret. "I meant between us. What happens to a marriage that survived on a lie for 6 months?" Margaret took his weathered hand in both of hers. "I don't know, but I'd like to find out if you're willing to try." Jack felt something shift inside his chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. The woman beside him had chosen justice over comfort, duty over happiness. She'd sacrificed their marriage to save strangers, then trusted him to understand why. Maybe that was worth fighting for. Maybe love could survive even necessary betrayals. In the strobing emergency lights of Tunnel 9, surrounded by the wreckage of conspiracy and corruption, Jack Riverside began to plan a different kind of resurrection. The road back. The drive back to Devil's Creek took place in silence, Margaret's hand resting on the bench seat between them, like a question neither was ready to answer. Dawn was breaking over the Montana peaks, painting the sky the color of old copper, and Jack found himself studying his wife's profile in the amber light. 6 months ago, he'd memorized every line of her face while she lay unconscious in the hospital. Now those same features seemed foreign, belonging to a woman who'd orchestrated her own death with the precision of a surgeon. They'd spent 3 hours at the FBI field office in Billings, giving preliminary statements that would become the foundation for prosecutions spanning multiple states. Agent Chen had been thorough but gentle, walking them through what the next months would bring: grand jury testimony, media scrutiny, and the slow unraveling of a criminal network that reached further than Jack had imagined. Carver's operation was just one node in a web that stretched from Calgary to Denver, using abandoned mining infrastructure to move human cargo like cattle through shipping channels. "Turn here," Margaret said softly as they approached the ranch road. Her first words in 50 miles. Jack slowed the truck, gravel crunching under the tires. The familiar landmarks, the weathered gate, the oak tree he'd planted for their 10th anniversary, the barn where they'd sheltered during the tornado of '98, felt like monuments to a marriage that had died in those tunnels beneath Crow's Ridge, not from lack of love, but from an abundance of secrets. The ranch house sat exactly as he'd left it 12 hours earlier, when he'd driven away thinking he was attending his wife's funeral. Margaret's coffee cup was still on the kitchen counter, unwashed from the morning she'd disappeared. Jack had preserved it like a shrine, unable to disturb even the lipstick mark on the rim. Now the gesture seemed pathetic, grieving for a ghost while the living woman had been chained in darkness, gathering evidence against monsters. Margaret stood in the doorway, looking at their home like a tourist examining someone else's life. "You kept everything the same." "I was waiting for you to come back," Jack said, then caught himself. "I was waiting for a dead woman to come back." Apparently, she did. The words came out harsher than he'd intended, but Margaret didn't flinch. She'd developed armor during her months underground, a professional distance that made her seem untouchable, even when she stood 3 feet away. "I need to tell you something else," she said, "about the night I disappeared." Jack's blood went cold. After everything, the deception, the fake funeral, the 6 months of manufactured grief, there was more? "The car accident wasn't random," Margaret continued. "I was running when it happened. I'd just photographed the shipping manifests at Carver's clinic, and I knew someone was following me. I was driving to the sheriff's station when they forced me off the road. They tried to kill you." "Yes, and when that failed, when Carver realized I was still alive at the crash scene, he made a choice. He could finish the job, or he could use me." Margaret's voice remained steady, clinical. "He chose to use me, to fake my death and keep me alive as leverage." Jack sank into his favorite chair, the leather creaking with familiar comfort. "But you weren't just a victim. Chen said you volunteered to stay undercover." "After 2 weeks, when the FBI made contact through Agent Chen, yes. I realized we could turn Carver's mistake into an opportunity." Margaret sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "But Jack, those first 2 weeks, when you thought I was dead, I was planning to escape. I was going to come home to you. Consequences be damned. What changed your mind?" Margaret's composure finally cracked, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I saw the other women, the ones who'd been there for months, who'd given up hope. I watched Carver treat them like inventory, like objects to be shipped and sold, and I realized that if I escaped, if I exposed just the local operation, the larger network would adapt and disappear." Jack understood. His wife, the woman who'd spent weekends volunteering at the shelter, who couldn't drive past roadkill without saying a prayer, had faced an impossible choice: save herself or save strangers. She'd chosen strangers. "The Bureau offered to stage my rescue," Margaret continued. "Make it look like I'd died in captivity so I could return to my normal life. But by then, We were so close to mapping the entire trafficking network. Another few months, and we could save dozens of women. So, you stayed dead. I stayed dead. And I let you grieve because your grief was what kept me safe. As long as everyone believed Jack Riverside was a broken widower, no one suspected his wife was alive and documenting their crimes. Jack stared at the woman across from him. His wife, his stranger, his ghost made flesh. The rational part of his mind admired her courage, understood her sacrifice. But his heart felt like it had been excavated, hollowed out and refilled with someone else's emotions. Outside, cattle lowed in the distance, calling him back to the rhythms that had sustained him through 6 months of manufactured mourning. But those rhythms belonged to a different man, one who hadn't learned that love could survive death, but might not survive resurrection. The final confrontation wasn't with criminals in dark tunnels. It was with the woman sitting in his living room, wearing his wife's face, asking him to believe in second chances. Jack Riverside had committed to finishing what they'd started. Now he had to decide what that meant. Jack stood slowly, his joints protesting after the night's ordeal. Margaret watched him with careful eyes, the way someone observes a wild animal that might bolt or attack without warning. The morning light streaming through their kitchen windows revealed the subtle changes 6 months underground had carved into her face, new lines around her eyes, a wariness that hadn't existed before, a stillness that spoke of survival rather than peace. "There's going to be a press conference," Jack said, moving to the coffee maker with mechanical precision. "Agent Chen wants us there. Show a united front," she called it. "Reassure the public that justice is being served." "And are we?" Margaret asked quietly. "United, I mean." Jack measured grounds into the filter, his hands steady despite the earthquake in his chest. Everything they'd built together, 23 years of marriage, shared dreams, quiet mornings like this one, had been held hostage to serve a greater good. Noble, perhaps, necessary, certainly, but nobility and necessity were poor foundations for rebuilding trust. "I don't know what we are anymore," he said, "but I know what we need to do." Chen was right about the media circus that's coming. Devil's Creek is about to become famous for all the wrong reasons, and people are going to want answers from us. From you. Margaret joined him at the counter, close enough that he could smell the lingering antiseptic from her medical examination mixed with something deeper, the scent of earth and fear and things he didn't want to imagine. "Jack, before all that starts, before we're public property again, I need you to understand something." He turned to face her fully for the first time since leaving the tunnels. Up close, the changes were more pronounced. This wasn't just his wife aged by 6 months. This was a woman transformed by witnessing humanity's capacity for evil. The Margaret who'd disappeared had been optimistic despite everything, believing fundamentally in people's goodness. The woman standing before him had looked into darkness and emerged with different eyes. "Every night down there, when I documented their transactions, when I pretended to be compliant while gathering evidence, I thought about this kitchen," she continued. "About Saturday mornings, when we'd read the paper together and argue about whether to plant tomatoes or peppers in the south garden. About your terrible habit of leaving coffee rings on the counter." Her voice caught. "About whether you'd forgive me for choosing strangers over our marriage." Jack poured 2 cups of coffee, muscle memory guiding him to add cream to hers, black for himself. Simple, domestic rituals that felt profound after everything that had shattered between them. "I'm not sure forgiveness is the right word. You saved lives, Margaret. 47 women who won't be trafficked because you stayed in hell long enough to map the entire network. But I destroyed us in the process." "Did you?" Jack handed her the mug, their fingers brushing in an echo of 10,000 similar mornings. "Or did you show me exactly who I married? Someone who'd sacrifice everything, including her own happiness, to protect people she'd never even met?" Margaret stared into her coffee, as if it held answers to questions they were both afraid to ask. "The woman who made that choice isn't the same one who comes home to you now. I've seen what people do to each other when they think no one's watching. I've heard conversations about buying and selling human beings like they were discussing livestock prices. She stopped, shaking her head. "I'm not sure I know how to be your wife anymore." How to live in a world where we worry about cattle prices and garden vegetables when I know what's happening in the shadows. Jack set down his mug and studied the woman he'd thought he'd lost forever. This was the test agent Chen hadn't mentioned, the challenge no federal handbook could prepare them for. Not whether their marriage could survive Margaret's deception, but whether it could accommodate the truth she'd learned about the world's hidden cruelties. "Then we figure it out together," he said finally. "Starting with that press conference. We stand united not because our marriage is perfect, not because the last 6 months didn't leave scars, but because what you did down there mattered. And because walking away now would dishonor every woman you helped save." Margaret looked up, and for the first time since the tunnels, he saw the ghost of his original wife in her expression, the woman who'd married him despite his rough edges, who'd built a life on this ranch through droughts and market crashes and all the small disasters that test a partnership's foundation. "The trials will take months," she said. "Testimony, cross-examinations, media attention. Our life won't be private again for a long time. I know. And I can't promise I'll be the same person I was before this started. I can't unknow what I know now." Jack reached across the space between them and took her hand, the hand that wore his wedding ring, that had documented unspeakable crimes, that had chosen justice over safety. "Then we'll learn who you are now, and who we are together." Outside, the Montana sunrise painted their ranch in shades of gold and possibility. The final test wasn't surviving the darkness beneath Crow's Ridge. It was choosing light despite everything the darkness had revealed. The sound of vehicles approaching their ranch road cut through the morning quiet like a blade. Jack moved to the window, coffee still warm in his hand, and felt his blood turn to ice. 3 black SUVs were speeding toward the house, kicking up dust clouds that marked their urgency. These weren't FBI vehicles. He'd learned to recognize the subtle differences in the past 12 hours. These were something else entirely. "Margaret." His voice carried a warning that made her join him at the window instantly. "No," she whispered, her face draining of color. "They can't know. The arrests were clean. Carver, Webb, all of them are in custody." But even as she spoke, Jack could see the truth in her eyes. 6 months underground had taught her that criminal networks didn't collapse with a few arrests. They adapted, evolved, and eliminated threats. The black SUVs pulling into their yard weren't here for testimony or evidence. They were here for Margaret. The vehicles formed a semicircle in front of the house with military precision. Doors opened simultaneously, disgorging men in dark suits who moved with the fluid coordination of professionals. Jack counted 6 of them, all carrying weapons they weren't bothering to conceal. His hunting rifles were locked in the gun safe upstairs. Might as well have been on the moon. "Back door," Jack said, grabbing Margaret's hand. But as they turned toward the kitchen, movement in the rear yard caught his eye. 2 more men, positioned to cut off their escape. Whoever these people were, they'd studied the ranch layout, planned for contingencies. Margaret's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The display showed Agent Chen's number. "Answer it," Jack said. "Speaker." "Margaret, listen carefully." Chen's voice crackled with static and urgency. "We have a problem. The arrests triggered something, automated communications to outside contractors. We missed a failsafe in their network. You're compromised." Through the front window, Jack watched the lead figure approach the house. Middle-aged, gray hair, expensive suit that looked out of place in rural Montana. But it was his eyes that chilled Jack's blood. Calm, professional, dead. This wasn't anger or revenge. This was business. "How long until backup arrives?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier than Jack felt. 20 minutes minimum. Rural roads, distance from Billings. Chen's transmission cut out. 20 minutes. Jack's mind raced through possibilities. The house was well built but not fortified. His nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. The landline phone was in the kitchen, where windows offered clean sightlines for anyone wanting to discourage communication. A polite knock on the front door echoed through the house. "Mr. and Mrs. Riverside?" The voice was cultured, patient. "My name is Vincent Calder. I represent certain business interests affected by recent events. I'd like to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to our situation." Jack had heard that tone before, the false courtesy of men accustomed to getting their way through, intimidation disguised as negotiation. But Margaret stepped forward, her shoulders squaring in a way he recognized from their early marriage, when she'd faced down bank loan officers and cattle buyers who'd tried to take advantage of a woman in a man's business. "What kind of resolution?" she called through the door. "The kind where everyone walks away alive, Mrs. Riverside. You've caused considerable disruption to a very expensive operation. 47 assets recovered, millions in infrastructure compromised. My clients are willing to consider this a cost of doing business, provided certain conditions are met." "What conditions?" "You disappear, permanently this time. No testimony, no trials, no media interviews. Simply vanish, and your husband continues his quiet ranching life without further interference." Jack felt something primal surge through his chest. Not fear, but rage. These men had turned his wife into a ghost once already. Now they wanted to finish the job, erase her completely to protect their profit margins. "And if we refuse?" Jack called out. Calder's chuckle carried through the door like winter wind. "Mr. Riverside, your wife spent 6 months in our facilities. She's seen faces, heard names, documented operations across multiple states. She represents what we in the business call an unacceptable liability. We're offering her a peaceful retirement instead of a violent termination." Margaret moved closer to Jack, her hand finding his. "There's a third option," she said loudly enough for Calder to hear. "The one where I testify at every trial, identify every face, and make sure your business interests spend the rest of their lives in federal prison." The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Then Jack heard the unmistakable sound of safeties being disengaged, weapons being readied for action. "Mrs. Riverside," Calder said, his courtesy finally slipping, "you misunderstand the nature of your situation. This isn't a negotiation. This is a courtesy call." Through the kitchen window, Jack saw the rear guards moving closer to the house. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether Margaret's sacrifice had meaning, whether 47 rescued women would see justice served, or watch their savior disappear into the same darkness that had nearly claimed them. The confrontation Margaret had spent 6 months preparing for wasn't in a courtroom or congressional hearing. It was here, in their kitchen, with 20 minutes until help arrived and 6 armed men who'd come to silence the truth forever. Jack's mind raced through their limited options as the weight of armed men surrounded their home. 20 minutes for backup felt like 20 hours. But then his eyes fell on Margaret's phone, still connected to Agent Chen despite the static, and an idea crystallized. Dangerous, desperate, but their only chance. "Chen, are you still there?" he whispered into the phone. "Barely. Signal's weak, but I'm recording everything." Jack met Margaret's eyes, seeing understanding pass between them. After 23 years of marriage, some communications needed no words. They both knew what had to happen next. "Mr. Calder," Jack called through the door, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned managing ranch hands and cattle buyers. "You want to negotiate? Then let's negotiate properly, face to face." "Jack, no," Margaret breathed, but he squeezed her hand. "Trust me," he murmured, then louder, "my wife comes out with me. We discuss terms like civilized people." Calder's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "Mr. Riverside, I admire your spirit, but you're hardly in a position to set conditions." "Actually, I think I am." Jack moved toward the gun safe, making enough noise for it to be heard through the door. "See, this is my land, my home, and Montana law is very clear about what a man can do to protect his property. You want my wife? You'll have to come through me to get her." The metallic click of the safe opening echoed through the house. Jack retrieved his father's Winchester, the same rifle that had protected this ranch for 3 generations. It felt solid in his hands, familiar weight against the chaos swirling around them. "Jack, what are you doing?" Margaret's voice carried a note of panic. "What I should have done 6 months ago." He checked the rifle's chamber, muscle memory from decades of hunting guiding his movements. "Should have protected my wife instead of letting her walk into danger alone." Through the window, he could see Calder conferring with his men, professional killers calculating angles, exposure, acceptable losses. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated what a Montana rancher would do when cornered on his own land. "Here's my counteroffer, Calder," Jack called out, positioning himself where his voice would carry clearly to Agent Chen's phone. "You and your men turn around and drive away. In exchange, I don't start shooting trespassers on my property." Mr. Riverside, "You're outnumbered 6-1. Maybe. But I know every inch of this land, every sightline, every piece of cover. How well do you think your city boys will do in a ranch fight?" Margaret grabbed his arm. "Jack, this is suicide. You can't take on 6 armed men." He turned to face her, seeing not the traumatized woman from the tunnels, but the partner who built this life with him through every challenge the land and weather could throw at them. "I'm not trying to win, Margaret. I'm buying time. Chen's recording everything, names, voices, threats. Even if something happens to us, the evidence survives." Understanding dawned in her eyes. This wasn't about heroics or masculine pride. This was about ensuring that her sacrifice in those tunnels meant something, that the women she'd helped save would see justice served. "Besides," Jack continued, checking his watch, 18 minutes until backup arrives. These professionals will want to be gone before FBI agents start arriving. Every minute we delay is a minute closer to them walking away." Outside, Calder's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Mr. Riverside, you have 60 seconds to send your wife out the front door. After that, we come in and collect her ourselves." Jack moved to the window, rifle visible, and made eye contact with the gray-haired man who'd threatened everything he held dear. "Then I guess you better bring body bags, because the only way Margaret leaves this ranch is if I'm too dead to stop it." The words hung in the morning air like a declaration of war. Margaret moved beside him, her medical bag in her hands, not to flee, but to tend whatever wounds the next few minutes might bring. 23 years ago, you promised to love and protect me," she said quietly. "I release you from that promise, Jack. Don't die for my choices." He looked at the woman who'd sacrificed everything to save strangers, who'd let him grieve a fake death rather than compromise an investigation that could rescue dozens of trafficking victims. The woman who'd chosen justice over safety, others over herself, truth over comfort. "I'm not dying for your choices, Margaret. I'm living for them." Through the kitchen window, Jack saw Calder signal his men. Whatever happened next would determine whether 6 months of careful investigation and documented evidence would see courtrooms or graves. 17 minutes until help arrived. Jack Riverside had spent his life protecting things that mattered: cattle from predators, crops from weather, his land from those who'd exploit it. Now he had 17 minutes to protect the most important thing of all, the woman whose courage had lit a candle in humanity's darkness, and the justice that candle might bring. The first shot shattered the kitchen window, sending glass cascading across the linoleum like deadly confetti. Jack dropped below the sill, pulling Margaret down beside him, as the sound of splintering wood announced Calder's men had abandoned negotiation for direct action. "So much for civilized discussion," Jack muttered, checking his rifle's sight picture through the window frame. Outside, the professionals were advancing with tactical precision, 2 toward the front door, 2 flanking the house's sides, while Calder and another man maintained overwatch from behind their vehicles. Margaret's phone crackled with static. "Jack, Margaret, shots fired, backup is rolling hard. 14 minutes out." 14 minutes. Jack squeezed off a round toward the nearest SUV, not aiming to kill but to remind Calder's team that this wouldn't be the simple execution they'd planned. The bullet sparked off reinforced metal, but it achieved its purpose. The advancing men took cover, their timeline suddenly complicated. "Kitchen's compromised," Margaret said, crawling toward the hallway. "Living room windows give better angles." They moved through their own home like refugees, staying low, using furniture as shields. 23 years of marriage had taught them to work as a unit, but this choreography was born of desperation rather than domestic routine. Jack repositioned at the living room window and immediately saw the problem. Calder's men weren't just advancing, they were herding him and Margaret toward the back of the house where the terrain offered no escape routes. Professional killers didn't survive by taking unnecessary risks. They were turning the ranch house into a killing box. Another window exploded inward, followed by the metallic clink of something rolling across the hardwood floor. "Grenade!" Margaret shouted, but Jack was already grabbing her, pulling them both behind the heavy oak dining table his grandfather had built. The flashbang detonated with a concussion that turned the world white and silent, leaving Jack's ears ringing and his vision swimming with afterimages. Through the disorientation, he heard boots on his front porch, the splintering crack of his door being kicked open. Professional courtesy had officially ended. 12 minutes, Chen's voice emerged from somewhere in the static-filled chaos. Jack's vision cleared enough to see the first man through the doorway, young, efficient, scanning for targets with the fluid movements of military training. Jack's Winchester spoke once, and the man dropped, his weapon clattering across the floor Margaret had mopped just yesterday morning. One down, Jack called to Margaret, who was pressed against the wall beside him, her medical bag clutched like a shield. Blood ran from a cut on her forehead where glass had found its mark, but her eyes remained sharp, focused. 5 left, she replied, then louder. "This is Dr. Margaret Riverside. I'm documenting everything for federal evidence. Names, faces, methods. It's all being recorded and transmitted to FBI agents currently en route." Her words had the desired effect. The advance through the house slowed as Calder's remaining men realized they weren't just eliminating a witness, they were creating one. Every action, every face shown in this house would be preserved for prosecution. "Calder," Jack shouted toward the broken front door. "Your timeline's shot. FBI's 10 minutes out. Your men are compromised, and every second you stay here creates more evidence. Cut your losses and run." "Mr. Riverside," Calder's voice carried from the porch, still maintaining that professional calm despite watching his operation collapse. "You're only delaying the inevitable. My clients have very long memories." "Maybe, but they also have very expensive lawyers who'll advise cutting ties with operations that attract federal attention." Jack shifted position, keeping his rifle trained on the doorway. "How much is my wife's silence worth when staying here means explaining to those clients why you led FBI agents straight to them?" The silence that followed felt different. Not the pause before an assault, but the hesitation of a man calculating odds that had shifted against him. Through the broken windows, Jack could hear the distant sound that changed everything, helicopter rotors cutting through the Montana morning air. "Sir," one of Calder's men called urgently. "We have aircraft approaching from the southeast, multiple units." Margaret's phone crackled with Agent Chen's voice. "Air support is on station. Ground units 3 minutes out." Jack watched through the window as Calder made the calculation every professional killer learned to make when an operation became too expensive to justify, when discretion became more valuable than completion. The gray-haired man signaled his team with sharp hand gestures, and suddenly the shadows around the house were moving away rather than closer. "This isn't over," Calder called toward the house, but his words carried the hollow ring of a man already in retreat. "Yes, it is," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the blood on her face and the tremor in her hands. "It's been over since the moment I chose to document everything instead of staying silent." The sound of engines starting, vehicles departing, marked the end of 6 months that had begun with a car crash and led through tunnels beneath the earth to this moment. A Montana rancher and his wife, standing in their destroyed home, having chosen truth over safety and justice over silence. The immediate threat was over. Now came the harder test, living with the choices they'd made and the world those choices had revealed. The helicopters settled onto the pasture like metal locusts, their rotors beating the autumn grass flat. Jack stood on his bullet-scarred porch, watching FBI agents pour from the aircraft with tactical precision that made Calder's retreat look like the smart play it had been. Margaret leaned against the doorframe beside him, medical gauze pressed to the cut on her forehead, her other hand still gripping the phone that had documented everything. "Mr. Riverside, Mrs. Riverside." Agent Chen approached with the controlled urgency of a man who'd spent 3 hours believing his star witness might be dead. "Are you injured?" "Nothing that won't heal," Margaret said, though Jack noticed how she favored her left side where she'd hit the floor during the flashbang. "Did you get recordings of everything?" "Every word. Calder, his team, the threats. It's all admissible evidence. Chen surveyed the destroyed house, shattered windows, splintered door, bullet holes in walls that had stood unmarked for 3 generations. We'll have crime scene techs here within the hour, but the immediate priority is getting you both to safety. Jack shook his head. This is our home. Sir, with respect, these people have demonstrated they're willing to kill to protect their operation. Until we have Calder and his team in custody, then you better find them fast. Jack's voice carried the same finality he'd used with Calder. Because Margaret and I aren't running anymore. The next 4 hours blurred together like a fever dream. Crime scene photographers documenting the battle in their kitchen. FBI technicians collecting shell casings from their living room floor. Paramedics treating Margaret's cuts while she insisted on giving her statement immediately, completely, holding nothing back. Jack found himself standing in his barn, watching agents process the scene through his broken front window. The structure of his life, ranch work, cattle management, the simple rhythms of land and weather, felt foreign now, like clothes that no longer fit properly. Dad? He turned to find Sarah in the barn doorway, her face pale with shock. Behind her stood Tom, both of them having driven from Billings the moment Chen's people contacted them about the shooting. Jesus Christ, Dad, what happened here? Tom's voice cracked like it had when he was 12 and had seen Jack treat a calf mauled by coyotes. Jack looked at his children. Successful, safe, living normal lives in a world where trafficking networks and professional killers existed only in news stories about distant places. How could he explain that their mother had spent 6 months in hell to save strangers? That their father had just killed a man in their childhood kitchen? Your mother's alive, he said simply. Everything else we can figure out later. Sarah burst into tears then, the kind of bone-deep sobs that came from 6 months of grief, suddenly transformed into impossible joy. She pushed past Jack and ran toward the house, toward Margaret, who was emerging from her interview with Chen. The reunion happened in their destroyed living room, among broken glass and evidence markers. Sarah collapsed into Margaret's arms like she was 5 years old again, and Margaret held her daughter with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd learned exactly how precious normal moments were. Tom hung back, his engineer's mind clearly struggling to process the impossibility. Mom, we buried you. I gave a eulogy. Margaret looked up from Sarah's embrace, her eyes finding Tom's face. I know, sweetheart. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what you went through. But how? Tom's voice broke completely then, and suddenly he was crying too, crossing the room to wrap both his mother and sister in his arms. Jack watched from the doorway, feeling like an intruder in his own family's moment of healing. 6 months ago, he'd been a widower drowning in guilt and whiskey. Now he was a man who'd killed to protect his wife, who'd learned that evil operated with corporate efficiency while good people made impossible choices in underground darkness. Jack! Margaret's voice drew him into the circle of his family's arms. Come here. He joined them there among the debris. 4 people who'd been broken apart by lies and violence, now slowly knitting themselves back together with truth and touch. But Jack could feel the weight of change in every breath. The man who'd stood at Margaret's graveside no longer existed. Neither did the woman who'd been declared dead to serve justice. They were different people now, marked by choices that couldn't be undone, knowledge that couldn't be unknown. The trafficking ring would face prosecution. 47 women would testify about their rescue. Justice would be served, but it would be served by a family that had learned exactly what justice cost. As afternoon faded into evening and the FBI finished their immediate work, Jack stood with Margaret on their damaged porch, watching the sun set over land that felt both familiar and foreign. Think we can rebuild? She asked, nodding toward their house, their life, everything the last 6 months had broken. Jack considered the question seriously. They could repair the windows, replace the door, patch the bullet holes, but the innocence, the simple belief that doing right and working hard guaranteed safety, that was gone forever. We can build something new, he said finally, something stronger. Margaret leaned against him, solid and real and alive. I'd like that. 3 months later, Jack stood in the same spot on the porch, watching his breath steam in the December air. The new windows reflected morning sunlight without the spiderweb cracks of bullet impacts. The front door, solid oak like the original but reinforced with steel core, opened and closed without the memory of splintering wood. Margaret emerged with 2 cups of coffee, steam rising like small prayers in the cold. She'd insisted on the same ceramic mugs they'd used for 23 years, refusing to let violence claim even the smallest rituals of their marriage. "Sarah called," she said, settling beside him on the porch swing he'd rebuilt from his grandfather's original plans. "The trial date's been set. March 15th. Jack nodded, unsurprised. The legal machinery had been grinding forward with methodical precision since Calder and his team were arrested at the Canadian border. 47 women ready to testify, mountains of evidence from the mining tunnels, Margaret's 6 months of documented observations from inside the trafficking network. "You ready for that?" he asked. Margaret sipped her coffee, considering. "I was dead for 6 months, Jack. Standing in a courtroom and telling the truth seems manageable by comparison." She'd changed in ways that went deeper than the small scar on her forehead, or the way she sometimes woke at night listening for sounds that weren't there. The woman who'd been declared dead to serve justice had emerged with a clarity that was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. "Tom's bringing Emma for Christmas," Jack said, changing the subject to easier ground. Their son's engagement had been the one purely good piece of news in a year full of complicated revelations. "First granddaughter-in-law Christmas," Margaret smiled. "Think she's ready for Riverside family chaos?" Jack laughed, the sound coming easier now than it had 3 months ago, after meeting us during FBI interviews and crime scene cleanup. "If she's still willing to marry into this family, she can handle anything." The sound of a truck on their access road interrupted the morning quiet. Jack's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle that now lived beside the front door, a reflex that might never fully fade, but he recognized the engine sound. Doc Peterson making his weekly check on Margaret that had become as much social call as medical necessity. "Morning, folks," Peterson called, climbing from his truck with the careful movements of a man who'd learned not to make sudden gestures around people who'd been shot at recently. "How's the patient today?" "The patient is fine," Margaret replied with mock irritation, and getting tired of being treated like she might break. But she submitted to Peterson's examination with good humor, understanding that his concern went beyond medical necessity. The entire community of Devil's Creek had been shaken by the revelation that a trafficking network had operated beneath their knowledge. Margaret's survival and courage had become a source of pride and hope in a town that needed both. "Physically, you're healing perfectly," Peterson announced, folding his stethoscope. "Emotionally, well, that's above my pay grade. But you seem like yourself again. Different, but yourself." After Peterson left, Jack and Margaret walked the property lines as they did every morning now, partly from rancher's habit, partly from the need to reclaim their land from the memory of violence. The cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that had seen helicopters and tactical teams, their bovine indifference to human drama oddly comforting. "I've been thinking," Margaret said as they paused at the fence line overlooking the valley where this had all begun. "About what comes after the trial." Jack waited, learning to give her space for thoughts that had been forged in darkness he couldn't fully comprehend. "Those women, the ones who survived, they're going to need more than court testimony to rebuild their lives. Medical care, counseling, job training." She turned to face him. "I want to help with that. Use my medical background, maybe work with the FBI's Victim Services Division." The request didn't surprise him. The Margaret who'd chosen to document horror instead of escaping it wasn't someone who could simply return to small-town family practice and pretend the tunnels had never existed. "What would that mean for us? For the ranch?" "It would mean traveling sometimes, consulting work, leaving you alone here more than either of us would like." Her voice carried the uncertainty of someone asking for something that might be too much. Jack looked out over land that had sheltered his family for 3 generations, then at the woman whose courage had lit candles in places where hope had died. The man who'd stood at her graveside would have begged her to stay safe, to choose the comfort of familiar routines over the risk of continued involvement in dangerous work. But that man no longer existed. "Then I guess I better learn to manage the ranch shorthanded," he said. Can't have my wife saving the world on an empty stomach. Margaret's smile was answer enough. That evening, as snow began falling on their rebuilt home, Jack Riverside sat beside his living wife and understood that some resurrections changed everything they touched. They were different people now, marked by knowledge and choice, but they were also exactly who they'd always been underneath, partners building something worth protecting, love strong enough to survive even death. The new beginning had already begun.